Kempshall. I hope I said your name right there. And he has recently come out with Star Wars: The Rise and Fall of the Intergalactic Empire, which I'm of course holding up here. And this is rather a unique book and a unique take on the Star Wars universe. Before we jump to begin, because the episode is about really 1914 and the first month of World War One, or the Great War. But before we do that, I want to discuss this book a little bit. I know you have so you have to clarify really with Lucasfilm first, but here's hoping they won't sue us after this conversation. But let's talk a little bit about, because what gave you the idea to this approach? Like I said, it's rather a unique idea to write this book it was a real history book just about the intergalactic empire.
Yeah, so, I mean, the thing is, I've wanted to write Star Wars books for years and years and years, but I'm a historian. That's my job, that's my trade, that's my training. So, I want to write Star Wars books, but you can look at it and go, well, Jason Fry is a novelist, and therefore he writes novels, and, Alexander Freed is a novelist, and Claudia Gray is a novelist. I don't know how to be those people, but I do know how to be me. And therefore I can be a historian and approach a topic like this as if I was a historian. And so there was a book previous to this that I was a co-author on that is called Battles That Changed the Galaxy, which is like a military history examination of kind of major battles in the Star Wars universe. And I got approached by DK in August 2020 to maybe start to do that. We wrote it through like kind of 2021. And really early on in that process, I was like, I want to pitch an extra kind of history book, like a grand narrative and kind of analysis of the Galactic Empire set after the sequel era. And pleasingly, I mean, it took a while. It always takes ages. One of the interesting things that I've learned coming from academia and coming from academic publishing is how long everything takes in normal publishing, right up until the moment when it's like, and now if you could just write that in 6 months, that'd be great. When it massively accelerates. So it took years for it to kind of work its way through the system to get to a point when, okay, here's the contract, off you go, start writing. But I knew that I thought there could be something really interesting and really fun and different about doing a book like this. And whilst, as I said, I'm a historian, I can't be Jason Fry, I can't be Claudia Gray, I can't be the other Star Wars authors. In a similar way, any one of them could absolutely write a book in a history style about something like the Galactic Empire. But because I'm a historian, I thought, well, actually, I might be the best person to write this in a way that, the more about Star Wars the more you get out of it, but the more like history reading you've read, the more you might get out of it, and you could have a really interesting, fun fusion of kind of like the two major parts of my personality.
And it really feel like I reading a history book. I was thinking about when I was going into this, like, was it going to be like to start from episode 3 and then you go like episode 4 and World 1, episode 4 and 5 and 6, etc. But you don't do it that way. You approach it different style, and you even have, like, if I may show, you have like notes in here as well, like, so it really feel in the back of the book, like, so it really feel like a proper academic history book in many ways, and it still feels, but it's not like academic reading, but still it's such brilliantly written.
Oh,
but
thank you.
I must say it was quite biased in my opinion, very pro-rebel, but it's brilliantly written in that way.
Thank you. Yeah, the in-universe historian definitely has thoughts and feelings about the Galactic Empire and is not shy about talking about them. But we wanted to have an index. We decided quite early on that we wanted to have footnotes. We wanted to introduce the things that make it feel like you're reading an actual history book. So that kind of suspension of disbelief, that's always a thing whenever you sit down and watch Star Wars, you have a suspension of disbelief, but that aspect of it those lines become blurred so quickly that you segue completely into, this is an in-universe history book, and to give the audience the feeling of what it would be like to live in that world, that all of these things have happened, and then read about it in a book.
Now, we had already, like I said in the introduction, of course, we are going to talk about the first month World War One, and of course, famously, one of the most famous books, perhaps, though it's not hardly referenced by modern historians today, is still highly influential. And I want to begin by talking, of course, about Barbara Tuchman's Jones of August, and of course, it's kind of inevitable when we discuss about a topic such as this, the first month of August, and of course, I'm talking about Jones of August, which of course inspired Kennedy as well during the Cuban Missile Crisis. So it's like I said, a huge influence on this in early World War One research and history. So let's discuss a little bit what makes Tuchman's book so insightful.
So I think, because I was thinking about it the other day, because it's been years since I've read The Guns of August, but I think the main benefit, and actually this is a type of thing that historians should consider, actually, that the main benefit of Tuchman's work is how readable it is. She crafts a really engaging, grand narrative, kind of analytic sweep of the lead up to the First World War. And, you know, the research is good. She knows what she's talking about, but that readability of it, which is, you know, the kind of the mark of what we might nowadays call public or popular history, of, you know, it's a book designed to be read by an ordinary audience. You know, it eschews many of the, you know, the wordier traits of academia, where, you know, speaking as an academic myself, you know, people write words that you can't say out loud. You know, that's not Tuchman's style.
Myself. I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
Yeah. So she positions it as an unfolding narrative story, which is always an interesting approach for history, because it's not like we don't know how this story ends. You know, you don't pick up The Guns of August and go, I wonder if the First World War happens. So, well, yeah, I'm pretty sure it does. This is a book exploring that lead up to it. And Tuchman doesn't, but there are times when you can go too far down the grand narrative, because you end up with kind of like a version of almost like great man history, you know, this force of nature, kind of Napoleonic, you know, the man of destiny stuff. But Tuchman takes the reader through a series of events which are so complicated and so convoluted and still so heavily debated regarding relative importance by historians, and creates a vision for an ordinary reader that is compelling and interesting and narrativizes the complexity. That's the real benefit of Tuchman's work, because he takes probably the most, I'm a First World War historian, so I'm biased, but probably the most important moment of the 20th century that is very, very hard to unpick, and makes it understandable in a way. Now, it makes it understandable in a 1960s way, and historiography has moved on, partly because new archives get open and stuff. So I don't necessarily know if I was kind of, if I had a PhD student and they were like, I want to look at the outbreak of the First World War for my brand new research. I don't necessarily know if Guns of August would be the first thing that I would recommend them reading, but it's super useful for if you were doing research on how example, sorry for interrupting you, but one example, of course, is more recently is Christopher Clark's book. I don't remember the name of it, but it's called The Sleepwalkers.
Yeah, Sleepwalkers, that is, and that's perhaps more recent work.
Yeah, so you might look at that, or and I'm pretty sure we'll come back to The Sleepwalkers, and maybe Margaret Macmillan's 1914, the year that ended peace, because more kind of modern versions of kind of the opening of the war. But if you were doing something on like, where does the popular understanding of the First World War come from? Because a lot of it is rooted in that 1960s period. Yeah, I would absolutely be telling my student, go and start with Guns of August and a variety of other kind of 1960s stuff, maybe some A.J.P. Taylor and the like, to get a grounding in where the popular public understanding of this history comes from. Because it's still super relevant on that count.
Now let's begin, and I want to take a little approach here because, of course, if you were to time travel back to 1914, let's say mid-July, somehow you travel back to mid-July and you meet someone in Europe, say German or English or French, and you told them that just a few months, even weeks from now, there will be a major European clash of powers in this on this continent. What do you think they would react? Would they be laughing, or would they be like, I can see that coming? Like, what would be their reaction if you told them that one of the greatest wars ever fought would begin just a few weeks from now?
I think that the answer to that depends very much on the nationality of the person that you're talking to. Because one of the interesting things about that July period, that kind of long summer of 1914 it's often referred to, is where exactly is the attention of the major European powers? So, me and you, we jump in our time machine, and we rock up in London, and we go into the Foreign Office. We maybe say hello to Edward Grey, and we tell everybody in there within a month, 37 days or so, Britain is going to be involved in a major conflict. I would put a reasonable amount of money on the fact that everybody in that room would think we're talking about Ireland, because that's where the focus of Britain is in 1914. There, the Irish issue, and constantly concerned that there is going to be armed conflict in Ireland. So that's going to be where the British think you're talking about. I think if we were to hop over to Paris or Berlin, then I don't think you'd need a lot of convincing to make them believe that within a few weeks Germany and France will be fighting each other, because both of them have been preparing for it and expecting it for years in the lead up to it. There's a slight tendency, particularly in Britain, to overestimate the British aspect of the outbreak of the First World War and underestimate the French aspect of the outbreak of the First World War. So, France is stinging still since the Franco-Prussian War. So there have been historians in France, Leonard Smith, Stéphane Audouin-Rousseau, Annette Becker, who've all kind of written about the eschatological element, the apocalyptic vision of the outbreak of the First World War in France, and the idea that basically, the German population is booming, the French population is lagging behind. They've had to extend conscription at various points in a bid to have an armed force that is relative inside to the Germans. That there's definitely it's a matter of time before France and Germany fight each other, feeling in Paris, and it's probably similar in Berlin. Because they also have an apocalyptic eschatological vision, and for them we're penned into the west by France, we're surrounded to the east by an unfriendly Russia, and fine, at the moment the Russians are a collection of barely literate farmers, but at some undefined point in the future the millions and millions of them will sort out an industrial revolution, and then the great Russian steamroller, which is the spectre that haunts all of Europe in the early part of the 20th century, will roll over us and grind us up. So in Germany as well, you've got it's probably a matter of time before we get embroiled in a European war. So why don't we do it on our own terms? Why don't we pick the time and the place? And that's always been the thesis of Fritz Fischer, the German War Aims, which comes out relatively concurrently with Tuchman's The Guns of August, the idea that Germany has been preparing for a major European conflict. They wanted it, they sought it out, and when their moment came, they took it. The idea that the Kiel Canal was widened for dreadnoughts to pass through, and the completion of that was in 1914, and all of these kind of records that supposedly exist within the German kind of military and foreign office and that. Actually, why would we wait for Russia to be ready? Why would we wait for France to be ready? So again, in our time machine travel around Europe, I reckon you could convince people in Berlin that their time is coming, and actually it's better for them to do this now than 5 years from now. If we went to Austria, After spending what I imagine would be 16 to 17 years waiting outside in the waiting room to speak to the emperor, as he kind of very slowly goes about his business, because that's how the Habsburgs treat their day-to-day life. Because they're also a slowly failing empire that, they've been looking for their moment to crush Serbia for years and years and years. So again, if you were to tell them actually the moment you've all been waiting for is gonna happen within a few short weeks, and the only thing it's gonna cost you is the member of the family that everyone hates, then I reckon they'd probably make that trade. It's a bad trade, and we'll definitely talk about Austria later. But I think the idea that actually, Europe is in the grips of like the best summer that's ever happened, and all is peaceful, and the First World War comes out of nowhere is maybe true in a population stakes. I don't necessarily know if people are walking down the street in London or walking down the street in Paris thinking any day now I'll be in uniform and I'm going to be sticking it to the Hun or anything like that. But I think within the halls of power there is a feeling that all of the major European powers in 1914 are concerned about the survival of their empires or their way of life. The British Empire isn't making as much money anymore. They're concerned about Ireland. They're concerned about getting shut out of the continent if the channel ports close. We spoke about France. We spoke about Germany. Austria-Hungary is concerned about, Serb nationalism and Russia and the like. So all of them are concerned that actually there's a ticking clock on their way of life, and if they let that clock tick too far, they're going to miss their opportunity. So I think within the power palaces of Europe, you could convince them that actually it's now.
So let's go to Sarajevo, of course, in August, or actually before that, I want to reconsider this for a second, and I want to talk about the alliances that are intact at this time in place. Because we have to talk about all the alliances, the Entente and the not the Axis that comes later, but the Central Powers. So let's talk about the Entente and the Central Powers alliances.
Yeah. So there's an interesting thing about both alliances in general and these particular alliances, because again, and this is a popularly held idea, that these alliances are designed to dissuade the other alliance. That these are competing alliances of kind of de-escalation, effectively. Nobody's going to pick a war with France because they know that Russia will get involved. Nobody's going to pick a war with Austria-Hungary because they know Germany's going to get involved. And on the surface, that is partially true. The reality is that that kind of disincentive of alliances only works if everybody knows what the alliance terms are. And that isn't true in 1914. It's not clear in Berlin what the alliance between, or whatever this agreement between Britain and France means. For example, Britain isn't in a formal alliance with France, but it's widely believed that there is some form of understanding, but nobody knows what that understanding is. So how can it be a disincentive, or it's something that's designed to dissuade the Germans if the Germans don't know what the message is? Similarly, Germany and Austria-Hungary are also in an alliance with Italy in 1914, and this alliance with Italy has always been heavily complicated by the fact that the Austro-Hungarians and the Italians hate each other. Italy and Austria-Hungary fight wars against each other. That's how they interact with each other outside of any other form of established diplomacy. They don't like each other. And there's a feeling like, so if we end up in a war with Germany and we end up with a war with Austria-Hungary, does that also mean that we're going to be in a war with Italy? And it's not clear what that alliance actually is. And it's so unclear that the Italians find themselves a get-out clause of this alliance, that actually they take this alliance to be a defensive thing, that if Germany or Austria-Hungary are invaded or similar, then Italy will join the alliance, but they don't view this as a defensive war, particularly given that Germany are the ones who's declaring war on everybody, and Austria-Hungary is the ones who's declaring war on everybody. It's only England that declares, or Britain that declares war on Germany. So Italy take that opportunity to go, yeah, we didn't sign up for you to have a war of conquest, so best of luck, chaps, but we're out of this, and give it 6, 8, 9, 10 months or so, they end up jumping in on the Allied side. So the actual alliances themselves are not properly understood. And the idea is that this secrecy will benefit the idea that it's a dissuading factor, when actually it massively complicates it, because no one knows for certain, and you need certainty when you're on the brink of war. You need to know if X happens, then Y will inevitably follow, and no one can say that. When it comes to the Entente agreement between Britain and France, which is always said, it's the alliance, it's what brings Britain into the war. Britain is not required by the Entente alliance to get involved in any military endeavours on the European continent. The Entente agreement between Britain and France mentions Germany a grand total of 0 times, and spends more time talking about fishing rights off Nova Scotia than it does about anything militarily. You have a whole kind of group of military plans and military conversations, is what they're referred to as, between Britain and France in the early 1900s, kind of 1903, 1905, that type. But so unclear are those agreements that the cabinet, the British cabinet, doesn't know what those agreements and what those plans are. It's only broken to them in 1914, in the lead up to the outbreak of war, when Edward Grey sits down and he's got Herbert Asquith there and goes, well, actually, what Britain and its empire have signed up to is potentially this. It's we'll use our fleet to protect French ports in the Channel and in the North Sea. Their fleet will protect the Mediterranean, and the British Expeditionary Force will be deployed to France. The cabinet has never voted on this. Parliament has never voted on this. The agreement includes the nominal acceptance that Belgium will get involved, but Belgium, as a neutral power, has told Britain and France, we're not going to have any military agreements or military conversations with you, because we can't pretend to be neutral whilst also planning for a joint defence of Western Europe. The Germans won't accept that we're neutral if we're also planning militarily to put our army into the field. So loads of it is based on assumption and confusion and secrecy, and that's a big problem if your alliance is supposed to be designed to prevent the other one from coming into action if no one knows what's going on.
Is that partly why the war took longer than... Because we don't discuss it later as well, of course, but as you know, nobody really thought... Everyone thought it would be over by December or later that year. Was this partly why the war dragged on so long? Because there was a lack of planning for a major war on the continent by the Entente, and as well that the war dragged out all the way into 1918?
Yeah, I think that there's partially an answer for that. So the Entente Alliance has all of the benefits and all of the downsides of being a coalition war. If we take the German example of the Central Powers, there is no confusion between Germany, Austria-Hungary, then add in the Ottoman Empire, about who's calling the shots. There's an idea at various points during the early years of the war that, if we can knock out the Ottoman Empire, or we can knock out Austria-Hungary, those are the props that are supporting Germany. So we knock out their allies and Germany will collapse. It's a fundamental misunderstanding about how that central power works. It's not Austria-Hungary and Germany that's propping... Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire that's propping Germany up. It's the other way around. Germany has full control of their allied strategy, but they have to drag the Austro-Hungarians and the Ottomans around. They have to feed them munitions, have to send them food and all these bits. But at the very least, they have strategic clarity. Strategy is whatever the Germans decide it is. The Entente Alliance has, the Allies are more useful. France and Britain and Russia are more useful in their own ways. Russia, dubiously. than Austria-Hungary are, or the Ottoman Empire is, because they've all got, resources of their own that they can make use of. They've all got kind of independent thinking. But it means there's no one calling the shots. And you don't get a Supreme Allied Commander until, like, the darkest days of 1918. So you're running a war by committee, which is a problem. There's a probably apocryphal quote from Marshal Ferdinand Foch, who ends up being the Supreme Allied Commander in 1918, that, he says that once I knew what it was to fight a coalition war, I lost quite a lot of respect for Napoleon. Because Napoleon fights coalition wars, and the idea is, wow, he's winning all of these battles against, he's fighting like 5 nations at a time. And then Foch is like, now that I've understood that trying to fight as a coalition of 5 nations is an absolute logistical strategic nightmare, because everyone's having arguments and they all hate each other, that it makes Napoleon's achievement look much less impressive, because he's fighting against 5 groups of nations who refuse to talk to each other. So that is probably an element that slows down. If there had been a unified Allied commander earlier in the war, then yeah, maybe the Britain, France, Russia, and the various allies would, chucking Belgium and then America when they arrived, may well have been able to win this quicker. But equally, Germany's plan for, the Schlieffen plan for winning the First World War is predicated on, we'll knock France out of this war super quickly, conquer Paris, they'll sue for peace, we'll drive the British Expeditionary Force, which is 100,000 men, it may as well not exist.
Was it kind of, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but was it kind of an early plan for an early blitzkrieg in a way?
Yeah, kind of, it's exactly that. Win on the Western Front and then send everyone east, and we'll, it's going to take the Russians weeks to even figure out, which end of the train we put in the front to even begin getting. But the Russians mobilise so quickly that actually the Germans have to weaken their thrust to the west to deal with an unexpectedly quick Russian mobilisation and invasion on the Eastern Front. And that's probably what ends up dragging the war out, because if the Russians had taken 3, 4, 5 more weeks, maybe Germany wins on the Western Front quicker than... you start getting into counterfactual history, and basically, you're playing board games at this point about, what happens if you do actually encircle Paris to the west rather than the east. But in that sense, maybe the Entente Alliance works, because actually Russia does pose a problem quicker than the Germans think that they will do.
Now, we have to, of course, go to Sarajevo and the shot of Franz Ferdinand, because it's inevitable, it will be criminal not to discuss his murder it's kind of funny that it almost didn't happen as well, so that because they kind of took a wrong turn. And I think actually, if I may draw some pop culture, I think the film Kingsman, kind of the Kingsman, the World War I Kingsman, though it's of course a wee bit inaccurate in some places, it's still kind of, funnily enough, picture this quite well when they take the wrong turn in the movie, and it's kind of, you see the I don't forget his name, but the guy who killed Franz Ferdinand, you see how his despair and almost kills himself because he almost fails. And so let's talk about, of course, another question is, was he a part of the group infamously known as the Black Hand as well?
Yeah, I think he probably was. And at the very least, kind of like, was getting weapons. And the Black Hand itself is quite convoluted. And there's almost like the Black Hand spectres under the bed element that, they're probably being built up into something they weren't necessarily actually were. And you're right, I've watched lots of First World War films and bits and pieces like that. And Kingsman is a ridiculous film, but that's they capture the spirit of what is effectively the most disorganised assassination attempt in history. Of, people throwing hand grenades under cars that go off, but it's protected, and then people feeling sorry because Archduke Franz Ferdinand's wife's there, and a guy who tries to attempt by jumping into the river, but it's summer, so the river level is really low, and all he ends up doing is breaking both of his legs and being beaten heavily by the crowd for daring to attempt to assassinate the Crown Prince. So you have this almost slapstick, comedic attempt at an assassination, which eventually succeeds with Gavrilo Princip finding, basically having the car drive past him because
It
they
sounds
take a
like a
long-term.
piece of fiction, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's so stupid that it can therefore only be true. And the assassination attempt is serious. People take the assassinations of royalty in the early 20th century, kind of at the end of the long 19th century, pretty seriously. But Franz Ferdinand is not a popular man. His wife is not popular at all. If this had happened under other circumstances, would the Austro-Hungarians have actually cared that much about this? Spin the wheel on it. But what it provides them is the excuse. The excuse, as we were talking about earlier, the reason to slap Serbia down and deal with...
The scapegoat.
Yeah, absolutely. And deal with this kind of... this latent nationalism, this Slav nationalism that is tugging away at the Austro-Hungarian Empire. An empire which is so what's the word I'm looking for? Disorganized, badly managed, dysfunctional is the word I'm looking for. It's an empire made up of a dozen latent nationalities who all at some point would quite like to be their own independent nations, ruled by a long-lived empire or kind of imperial royal family that is...
Franz Joseph is an old goat at this point.
He's an old guy. The Habsburgs are an old royal family. Their time is coming to an end, regardless of what happens in Sarajevo in 1914. And suddenly, the Austro-Hungarians have their opportunity to maybe try and deal with this problem on their own terms. It's an opportunistic moment in 1914. It's opportunistic for the Black Hand and the Serbian nationals to... Fantastic! This guy has driven his car past us on the National Day of Serb kind of patriotism. And the equivalent for kind of listeners is, particularly for those of you from kind of Britain and Ireland, is to imagine in like the 1960s or the 1920s so in the 1960s for like Queen Elizabeth II to drive through the streets of Derry or Belfast in an open-topped car on St Patrick's Day, is you're going to get a response from the people who live in Derry or live in Belfast. They're going to feel a certain way about this. The very act of doing it is provocative, and Franz Ferdinand knew it was provocative. It's an expression of Austro-Hungarian power, of we can drive through your city because we're the Habsburgs and we rule you like gods. And it turns out people are going to feel a way about that. So there's an opportunistic element from Gavrilo Princip and his merry men. And then the outcome of it, this assassination, provides the Austro-Hungarians the opportunity to be opportunistic on their own.
No, we kind of go into what if territory, because I got that question, because in his book, The Habsburgs by Martin Rady, he theorizes that, of course, there were no real, like we said, there were no real loss, no lost by the assassination of Franz Ferdinand, but Martin Rady theorizes that if Austria-Hungary had just went into Serbia almost at the moment of the assassination, and just went in there, kind of martial law, like, the whole World War I perhaps could have been avoided, but the reluctance and the dragging out a bit by, of course, somewhat probably helped by Kaiser Wilhelm II. What are your thoughts on this? That if they had kind of went in right away, could the war have been avoided in the first place?
I think there's a possibility that it could have been. As you say, you're starting to kind of what if, and then you could, and also, what if the Habsburgs were ruled by a giraffe? Would that have changed anything? But yeah,
that would be a fun one. I mean, they kind of look like a giraffe, though, to be fair.
Yeah, with the nose.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think there is a possibility because it changes. It doesn't necessarily change anything for Serbia. They don't want to be conquered militarily by the Austro-Hungarians. It doesn't necessarily change a great deal for the Austro-Hungarians. I think what it does is it changes things for Russia. Time allows Russia time to react, but also,
again, I'm sorry for interrupting you so many times, but we should also add that Serbians were Orthodox, right? So the reason why they feel this way is, of course, because they feel like they're protector of Greek Orthodoxy or Russian Orthodoxy, if you will.
Yes.
So they feel like they have a responsibility to protect those their fellow brethren.
Russia feels that because they view themselves as the guarantor of Slav survival of the Slavic people, but that comes with a pretty hefty asterisk of all of the royal families around Europe, regardless of which of the alliances aren't keen on having royalty assassinated in the streets. It's been a problem for the Russians in the past. It will be a problem for the Russians in the future, as it turns out. Spoilers. So you have a situation where you might end up with a situation where Russia is like, we view ourselves as the guarantors of Slav survival and the Slavic people, but we understand that the assassination of royalty is something to be treated quite harshly. So if Austria-Hungary had gone in and slapped everybody around a little bit quite quickly, it would not necessarily have given Russia time to react to it, but also it might have been the type of thing that the Russians could turn a blind eye to, because it's quite clearly a reaction to assassinating the head of, or the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. By delaying it and taking so long over it, then it starts to stop being about Franz Ferdinand and starts being about the military aims of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which is accurate. It does stop being about Franz Ferdinand and starts being about the military aims of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So the delay with it, partly because of the bureaucratic administrative inertia of the Habsburgs, but also because they want to organise and check in with Germany before they do anything. The second they start getting the Allies involved is a game changer for Russia, because, okay, fine, as soon as Austria-Hungary starts talking to Germany, then Serbia are going to start talking to Russia, and Russia are going to start thinking about what this means on their border of Slav nationalism. The delay is it changes the way that your action is going to be framed. If you're so angry about what's happened to Franz Ferdinand that in 6 weeks' time you leap into action, it's like, well, are you that angry still in 6 weeks that you're choosing to do this?
Reason.
Yeah. If you'd have done this in 6 days, then maybe that is a reflection of your strength of feeling, but it starts to look opportunistic.
Now, there is a quote. I want to take a look at about Russia and Germany, of course, because we know that they will invade Russia as well, Germany. And I want to ask about the reason why Germany in the First World War would go into Russia, because we know in the Second World War it's so-called Lebensraum, by living space, that Hitler wanted to invade Russia, and of course the threat of Bolshevism. But that wasn't a thing back in 1914. That would be a few years later on. But so what was it? And if I remember correctly, it was Lebensraum that Wilhelm II were worried about as well. Is that partly what the reason of the invasion of Russia by the Germans in World War I as well? The same reason, so-called supposedly made by Hitler as well.
It's not that dissimilar. I mean, Wolfson wouldn't necessarily have used the phrase Lebensraum. As we were saying earlier on, when the French are kind of worrying that, the German population is expanding and the French population is lagging behind. The German population is expanding. The Germans are concerned about living space, for want of a better phrase. And, they look off to the east at this great swathe of land that the Russians are barely using properly as far as the Germans are concerned. There's a lot of Russians there, but that can be negotiated. That there is an element of, well, why don't we just have it? And we'll use it properly because we're a modern, civilized nation, and the Russians are not. If the Russians are going to, at some point, get their industrial revolution going, and they're going to massively mechanize, and they're going to sort out all of the things of their their society and their technology, then that eventually, further down the line, that's going to be a problem, because then the Russians might look over us and go, well, why don't we just have that? So the Germans are basically thinking, we need space, we need security for the Reich, for the Kaiserreich. If we're going to, at some point, clearly the French are going to want to have a conversation with us about what happened in 1870 and 1871. So if this war is going to come at some point, we're absolutely going to have to fight the French. And that means we're going to have to fight the Russians. So why not fight the Russians when we've got the massive advantage for it? And then, when it comes to the peace, we'll just help ourselves to a bunch of land. And that's that's the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. People talk about the supposed harshness of the Treaty of Versailles. It's like, no, if you want to see a treaty that's really punitive on the side that's been beaten, take a look at the Brest-Litovsk Treaty, because the Germans give away literally nothing and take a ton from the beaten Russian Empire. They want Russian land, they want the Russian space and the supposed resources that lurk beneath the Russian soil that the Russians are not capable of using. So the German reasons for invading and fighting Russia, are partly strategic. We need to fight the French and we need to fight the Russians, so at some point we're going to cross the border. But it's motivated on things. It's not necessarily as genocidal as it is in the Second World War, but it's certainly motivated by similar desires and instincts to take this space, to take this land, so that the German population can expand.
Now let's talk about the mobilization, of course, and let's talk about the use of trenches, because we talked earlier that it was going to be that the idea was kind of blitzkrieg like World War One style. But as we of course know, that was not meant to be. So let's talk about the meaning of trenches and how that's kind of stopped the idea of the blitzkrieg. And again, I want to refer to a recent movie by, of course, the All Quiet on the Western Front, where we had tomorrow in Paris. So was there that feeling that tomorrow in Paris, and of course let's talk about how the very idea behind trenches, because it wasn't really a new invention. It was used in the American Civil Wars as well, so it wasn't really a new invention, but it was kind of modernized in the First World War. And let's talk about how this stopped the whole idea of and again, to use the Second World War term, blitzkrieg.
Yeah. So again, as I say, the term blitzkrieg wouldn't have necessarily the actual word itself, but that kind of concept of a mobile war.
I'm just using it to,
because it's something that people recognise, and you understand what, say, like a powerful lightning strike into France or Russia or general. And there is a hope. Certainly the Germans are planning to win the Western Front quickly. They're not planning on digging holes anywhere and waiting it out. The French aren't particularly interested in that either. Partly because they've taken a lesson from the Franco-Prussian War and the Russo-Japanese War, that basically for the Franco-Prussian War, the French army gets beaten because it gets bottled up in defensive fortifications. That actually getting stuck inside fortresses or trenches or like defensive strongholds means that you end up being caught under siege, and the German or then the Prussian armies will just go round you, and before you know it, you've been completely outmaneuvered. So the French are very reluctant to get locked down in defensive positions that they just get swept around. So they want to be aggressive and take the field and be proactive and be on the front foot. The Germans, they're not going to win the Western Front by digging trenches. They need to get through Belgium as quickly as possible, get through the French as quickly as possible, take Paris, drive the British Expeditionary Force into the sea, or just wipe it out, because they outnumber them like 9-1 in many ways. So they're planning on this being a very quick thing on the Western Front, and then the Eastern Front will be whatever the Eastern Front's going to be. And there's certainly a popular feeling like this war will be done by Christmas is the slogan, but there are certainly those within the various armies, particularly in the British Army, who are thinking, I'm not sure that this is going to be over by Christmas. And you end up with a situation, as I said earlier, because the Russians mobilise quickly and the Belgian army bogged the Germans down for longer than the Germans were expecting, and certainly longer than the Germans hoped for. So it takes some time to kind of siege Liège and Brussels, and eventually kind of in and around Ypres and the like. That they don't sweep through Belgium in as few days as they were hoping for, and they have to start sending troops and divisions from the Western Front back across the captured territories, back across France, and all the way across Germany, out to the Eastern Front to deal with this Russian enemy that's mobilised quickly and is invading. And what this ends up meaning is that the original Schlieffen plan, was to sweep all the way down the coast and capture Paris from the west. And they change it. They decide, well, actually, we're not going to sweep all the way down the coast. We're going to tuck inwards and capture and encircle Paris from the east. And in doing so, they lose contact with the British Expeditionary Force and various parts of the French army, who are left in this kind of grey area where suddenly they're on the flank of the German army. And they can counterattack, and you end up with the Battle of the Marne in August-September 1914, where the German army gets beaten at the Marne, and you end up with troops being shipped by taxis. Is the French myth of 1914 out of Paris to strengthen the position, and Marshal Joffre who's in charge of the French army is kind of given the credit for winning the miracle on the Marne, and as a result, the German army falls backwards, and the Allied army and the German army basically start leapfrogging each other back up towards the coast, trying to outflank each other and never quite managing to do it. And then, well, here's the coast, here's the North Sea, here's the English Channel. And as a result, the opportunity for a mobile war on the Western Front has gone by mid-autumn of 1914, and that's when you end up with kind of battles around Ypres and the like, and all the sides end up digging in, because there is no room for mobility anymore. There's no space for armies to move around, and then you have to dig in for trenches, and then you have to dig in for fortifications, and then you have to dig in for certainly a longer war that people were hoping for. The Allies are hoping that they can win this in 1915, and 1915 ends up being a dreadful year. The Germans take a slightly different view of it after kind of battles in Ypres in 1914 and battles in Ypres in early 1915. The Germans, they'll start thinking about the opportunity for like Verdun, but they effectively start fighting a defensive war on the Western Front. We've already captured all of this stuff, and you can't take it back from us. Then maybe at some point it could just be ours, and we'll call it quits. And it's then, from the irony of Germany being the aggressive power in 1914, the burden of being the attacker falls upon Britain and France. On the Western Front, for the vast majority of the war, they're the ones who have to launch attacks, because the French have lost territory. They have to get it back, and they're not going to get it back by waiting this out and being defensive. They have to attack, and therefore the British also have to attack. They have to force a resolution on the Western Front. So the Germans kind of get to wait it out a little bit until 1916 is kind of probably the defining year of the Western Front. But yeah, the trenches are an outcome of the failure of mobile warfare in 1914.
Now, it's the idea kind of, instead of being adversary, instead of just taking territory after territory, kind of morale-wise to demoralize the French troop instead of just going in, is the idea behind the trenches, kind of to, demoralization instead of just going in all in and acquiring new territory?
There is an element of that, of kind of, the longer we can drag this out, at some point, from the German point of view, the longer we can drag this out, at some point, the Allied will to carry this on is going to erode away. But the Germans are also concerned that the longer that this drags out, at some point America's going to get involved, and that's a problem, because they're probably only going to get involved in one side. And another answer to your question about whether it's the alliances that drag the war out into 1918, American neutrality probably drags the war out as long as it is. If America had picked a side earlier or actually been neutral, then the war probably ends. To my mind, probably ends earlier. But the fact that America exists as a prize to be won by the Allies and a shipping kind of material to the Allies, because they can't ship it to the Germans, probably changes the wider strategic makeup. But I think what, particularly for the Germans and even, to an extent to the British and the French, is they start looking at it as the problem on the Western Front as well. Is it easy for us to smash through the lines? Can we actually conquer land? Probably not. That's not to say we won't try, but it's difficult. So what can we do? We can kill a lot of the opposing soldiers, and at some point, if we kill enough of the opposing soldiers and don't lose enough of ours, then we'll hit the magic number. At which point their ability to wage war and launch offensives and their will and their morale to continue the war will reach a tipping point. So the strategy of all of the major nations, but even for the Allies, starts to change. So in French terms, the French have PSA as kind of like pierce the enemy lines in 1914 and 1915. So they launch lots of attacks, and they go generally quite badly and are horrible. They then move into grenadage, or nibbling, attritional warfare, wear the enemy army down. Doesn't necessarily matter if we conquer how much land we actually conquer. If we can kill off enough of the enemy soldiers in the enemy army that they can't replace them anymore, then this war will come to an end if we can maintain our own fighting force. So, the French are trying to do that. The Germans are trying to do it at Verdun. The British are trying to do it at the Somme. And eventually it changes in 1917, 1918 into tenir, to hold on. Partly to hold on for the Americans to arrive, but also to hold on to land that we've managed to capture, but also to hold on to outlast the will of the enemy. Because at some point, all of the losses of 1916 and 1917 are going to start to tell now, because the armies are running out of manpower. They can't replace, all of those great recruiting bursts of 1914. They're all gone. Those professional soldiers from pre-war, they're all gone. What you've got now are a variety of trained civilians. And at some point, that's not going to be good enough anymore. So you hold on until the breaking point comes. And it turns out that the breaking point comes for Russia in 1917. And it then comes for Austria-Hungary and Ottoman Empire in 1918. And then it comes for the German Empire in 1918. It comes to a lesser extent to the French army in 1917 with the mutinies, but those are more kind of workers' strikes than the collapse of the armed forces. So it turns out that the Allies can stick this out longer than the Central Powers can.
I want to talk a little bit about Russia as well. It's somewhat about them, but I remember from reading a book about Russia, and where Nicholas II said, I think it was as early as 1905 or something, where he said to someone, English diplomat, I'm fairly certain it was a diplomat, where he said something like, Russia is at least a decade behind when it comes to modern weapon and modern warfare. So let's talk a little bit about Russia's warfare weaponry and weapon distribution, because we know later on that will be a major problem in the First World War. There will be loss. They're sending people in without ammunition or guns, that is just sending them in to die pretty much. So let's talk about, it's my understanding, because I made an episode about the General World War I over a year ago, but where we talked about early on there weren't that much lack of ammunition as it would be later in the war. So let's talk about ammunition and weaponry for the Russian Empire and the Russian soldiers.
So you end up as well, it's a problem in the Second World War. So if you've seen, again, if we're talking about various fun films, if you've seen Enemy at the Gates, you end up at the beginning of that film with like all of the Soviet soldiers arriving, and it's okay, get into pairs, the man with the gun shoots the gun, the man without the gun follows the man with the gun. When the man with the gun is killed, the man without the gun picks up the gun and shoots the gun, and it's that. So, I've said various points about Russia's Industrial Revolution. Has not happened yet. Russia is not a mechanized industrial nation properly in 1914, which means they cannot do the industrial output that is required for fighting an industrial war. which means that at some point this is going to be a problem for them. You know, they've got stockpiles of ammo and bits and pieces like that, but, you know, being shot with a bullet from the late 19th century will probably hurt as much as being shot by a bullet from, you know, perfectly machined in 1914. You know, it's still going to kill the guy, probably, that you shoot with, but the rifles aren't as modern. Some of them are probably breech loading or barrel loading and the like. You're not necessarily kind of adept or covered with tons of modern machine guns or artillery pieces and stuff like that. The Russian soldier is not well trained in 1940. You know, there's a lot of them, and quantity has a quality of its own. But, you know, there are deficiencies in the Russian army. To give you the best indication of the problem that the Russians have in regard with munitions in the early part of the war, certainly kind of 1914, 1915, 1916, is there is such a thing as the Russian Expeditionary Force. And the Russian Expeditionary Force is a group of Russian soldiers who fight in France on the Western Front under the command of the French army. Because the Russians and the French have a joint problem, and the solution to it is the other one, is that the Russians need rifles, they need ammunition, they need artillery pieces, they need artillery shells, they need stuff that they can equip their soldiers with. And the French factories are churning this stuff out at a rate of knots. You know, they've got a lot of this, you know, the entire French industry is being bent to the task of producing ammunition and artillery and the like. What the French don't have is manpower. They need more men. But, you know, the opening moves of the French, the worst day in French military history for the First World War, comes in July and early August, with the battles of the frontiers, when they end up, you know, losing more men than the British lose on the first day of the Somme. The French desire to be aggressive turns out to be terrible. They need more men. Russia's got a lot of men, so they do a trade. The Russians sell soldiers to the French army in exchange for rifles, and you end up with this group of these Russian soldiers who end up fighting on the Western Front up until kind of 1916, 1917, at which point they get quarantined because of the Russian Revolution. The French are concerned that they're going to spread Bolshevik fervour like a cancer through the Russian army, so they end up bottling them up basically in a prisoner of war camp. But that's the Russian problem. They don't have enough rifles to equip their soldiers, and to get those, they have to send some of their soldiers to France. And that's the reality of the French lack of manpower, but it's the reality of the Russian industrial problem. They have too many men to arm, so they have to give some of them away in exchange for weapons to arm the rest.
Let's talk. You mentioned the Battle of Somme, and let's talk about it, which I believe was one of the first major battles in World War One. So let's talk about the Battle of Somme a little bit.
So the Somme is the first major battle for the British civilian army, for Kitchener's new armies, the people who queued up at recruiting stations in 1914 and the like, because Britain is the odd one out of the major European powers. It doesn't have compulsory military service, so it has a standing army of about 100,000, maybe 120, 150,000 professional soldiers, which is the British Expeditionary Force that takes the field in 1914 and is effectively wiped out by Easter of 1915 in the battles around Ypres. So the British are training up their civilian volunteers, and the Battle of the Somme is the first moment when they're going to be put into the field. But what you have in 1916 is at the end of 1915, the Entente Allies, you end up with Russia, France, Belgium, Britain, Serbia, and the like, all gather together and have a military conference to discuss the Allied strategy for 1916. And the Allied strategy is basically to attack the Central Powers on all fronts in a reasonably short amount of space of time, so that Germany can't shift forces from the Eastern Front to deal with the British and the French, because they're needed to fight the Russians who are attacking it on the Eastern Front. And similar problems for the Austro-Hungarians, Italy is also now in the war, so a possible attack from there. And the idea was basically attack the Central Powers on all fronts, obliterate their armies in the field so that they can't be replaced, they can't rotate forces in and out, and we'll win this war that way. Now, the fly in the ointment, the problem is that the Central Powers have also come up to the conclusion of the solution to this war might be to kill as many Allied soldiers as possible, or find a way to drive wedges between the Allies. And their solution is to attack the French at Verdun. They know that the French will have to defend it. There remains a great deal of confusion and controversy about what the Germans are actually trying to do. Are they actually, are they trying to capture Verdun and then move on to Paris, or are they hoping that the French will just stand and fight? Von Falkenhayn produces a memo after the war that says his idea was to bleed France white, that they actually didn't want to conquer Verdun at all, they just wanted to force the French to fight there. That memo probably is not true from the actual time of the war, so it's not entirely clear what Falkenhayn is trying to do. But the attack on Verdun means that the French can't fight as much at the Somme anymore. They need all of their men to fight at Verdun. This awful unfolding. It's the longest battle of the entire war. Which means that the previous plan of fighting at the Somme, which has no strategic value at all on the Western Front, but the value it had in the planning is it's the point when the British and the French armies meet. So they can attack together, shoulder to shoulder. No one army has to shoulder all of the burden. The British can go forward knowing that the French are going to do it, and the French can go forward knowing that the British have to do it as well. The French have become quite suspicious of what the British are planning. They keep hearing all of this stuff about this wonderful army that the British are planning on using. Any chance you could do it today, guys? Have you noticed that there's quite a lot of fighting going on? It would be great if you could get involved at some point. The British want to wait until 1917 to sweep really train up their army, sweep into battle, win the war, and then dominate the peace table. But that's never going to happen. So the British end up having to fight far more on their own than with the French, and they're fighting against German positions that have been super well prepared. The German positions on the Somme front are amazing. Deep concrete bunkers, machine guns, artillery pieces, and the like. And it goes quite badly because the British army is not well trained at that point. It's not made up of soldiers, it's made up of ordinary people. The British soldiers who do best are the ones closest to the French, because the French are pretty good at this now. The British can advance under the cover of French artillery fire, which is great. The French artillery is terrific, certainly by this point during the First World War. The further north of the river, which is the dividing point you get, the worse it goes. So you end up with the big statistic that on the first day of the Somme, the British Army have 57,470 casualties, of which 19,240 of them are killed. The single worst day in British military history. But they also kill a lot of Germans. And that battle carries on for weeks and months after, and it carries on way into the September-October time of 1916. And is it a victory for the British in territory terms? No. They do eventually capture Thiepval, which has been a nightmare for them throughout 1916, with the Germans able to have the heights of it. But the outcome of the Somme has to be understood in an outcome of 1916, in that the Germans launch a massive offensive against the French at Verdun, capture various of the most important fortresses. They captured Douaumont and Vaux and various other fortresses. And then over the rest of the year, slowly get forced back to exactly where they started from at Verdun. So the Battle of Verdun is a defeat for the Germans, because they don't destroy the French army and they don't capture the town. And also, they sustain, thousands and thousands of casualties at the Somme. And in his book, Bloody Victory, about the Somme, William Philpott, who teaches at King's College in London, basically lays out that the Germans sustain, in the region of 1 million, probably more, irreplaceable casualties in 1916 at Verdun and the Somme. Really good, well-trained soldiers, very, very sophisticated, competent infantry and they die or are irreplaceably wounded. And there goes the heart of the German army, to the extent that Germany ends up doing, so concerned are the Germans by the casualties of 1916, that they actually, think actually we're on the verge of probably losing this war, unless we do something that is bold, but also incredibly risky. And it turns out incredibly ill-advised, in that they restart unrestricted submarine warfare in the Atlantic, and they try and cut a deal with Mexico that if the unrestricted submarine warfare brings America into the war, which is what America had threatened previously, that if that happens, Germany will, apparently, this is a lie, militarily support Mexico's invasion of the southern states of America.
The Zimmerman telegram, of course.
Yeah, the Zimmerman telegram, which the British intercept immediately, decode and go, well, this is Christmas. They just need to find a way to get this into American hands without the Americans realising that they've been reading their post. And as soon as America finds out about this, game's up. So you can see how important that 1916 moment, how devastating the Somme and Verdun is to the German military, in that they are prepared to do the most ill-advised, riskiest possible strategy, because they are that concerned that they are on the verge of losing the war.
I want to talk a little bit about we talked so much about the German morale, but what about the British morale early on in the war of 1914, August 1914? You spoke about how it was kind of in a way kind of a disaster-ish, the Battle of Somme. But what were the British morale like, even though these were, so to speak, peasant soldiers that were fighting the Western Front?
Britain is such a weird outlier in many ways for the First World War. So, we mentioned beforehand, no compulsory military service. So the only people who are in the army in 1914, and the army isn't viewed as being a particularly respectable occupation for a man of military age for the war in 1914. So the only people who are in the army are the ones who want to be, whether economically, socially, whatever. You end up then with, very early in the war, you have the Battle of Mons, where the British army and the German army basically walk into each other early in 1914. And the German army just slaps this 100,000 men of the British army around. Huge casualties. Sir John French, who's the military commander for the British in 1914, sends a memo back to Britain, which is printed in basically the Times. It's called the Mons Memo often. That basically outlines that if the British army doesn't massively expand right now, we're going to lose this war. It gigs up. And it's that motivates the massive wave of recruitment in September of 1914. So people join up because they think, oh God, if we don't join up, we're going to lose. So we have, the Britain has to win. Everybody, as I said earlier, everybody's got their own kind of apocalyptic vision.
Was it the good guy versus bad guy feeling?
Yeah, I mean, you end up with a lot of propaganda of kind of like all the awful things the Germans are doing in Belgium. We should protect little, plucky Belgium. They are neutral. We have a treaty with Belgium that the Germans have violated. Germany also had a treaty guaranteeing Belgian neutrality. So you end up with like the Germans are the bad guys. We're the good guys, and we should act as the good guys do. And there are moments throughout the First World War when, British morale wavers and is low, and is kind of, people are concerned that, the war is dragging on, there's no end in sight, the casualties are mounting up. But Britain is the only major kind of a nation of the European powers that doesn't have a significant breakdown of the armed forces for morale purposes. The Germans have it, the Russians absolutely have it, and it costs them the war. The Germans eventually, their morale collapsed. The French mutiny in 1917. The Austro-Hungarians are useless. Ottoman Empire isn't much better.
But
and they have
Ottomans the Allies do kind of think the Ottomans will go down immediately. They do not capitulate until just a few months before 1918, and Gallipoli campaign was a huge success for the Ottoman
Yeah, it's
Empire.
the high point of the Ottoman Empire, militarily in that point. But with all of these things going in the back,
Of course, it doesn't really join until later on.
no.
Yeah.
But the British Army is the only one that doesn't suffer serious morale collapse during the First World War. So what you end up with is the conclusion that a lot of historians, including me, have to take is, yes, the British soldiers at various times are having an awful time. Casualties are massively rising. There are offensives that don't work. The Somme is a massive problem. Passchendaele and the Third Ypres are, bleak as all hell. But British soldiers stay in the trenches. They stay the course because, firstly, they believe that the war can be won, and it will be a good thing if they do win it, and that they should win it. Because you can't make that many armed men do something they don't want to do on some level. As the Russian example proves, as the German example proves in August, September 1918, when morale collapses in the German army, that at some point, when soldiers believe that either this war isn't worth winning or we're not going to win it regardless of what we do, they go home. They leave the trenches, they lay down their arms and they leave. And the British Army never does it. They never have a breakdown of morale in that sense. And it makes the British Army and the British case such an unusual one in the wider spectrum of the major combatants.
Something we're going to run up soon, but one thing I want to bring up, and this is I think a lot of people seem to forget this, is that, of course, we get tanks later on, but up until World War One, and we call it the dawn of warfare here. Horses are being used for war, and even in 1914, war horses are still being used maybe 3,000 years after the first usage. So that's kind of interesting to me, how horses are still being used as cavalry,
yeah,
or cavalry, however you want to say it. But it's still fascinating how early in World War One horses are still major usage in the war.
Yeah, and there were certainly in that early part of 1914 when it's all a kind of a war of movement, the horse is incredibly useful tool for various armies to cover distances quickly when they need to cover distances quickly, and horses also prove to be fairly useful at various other points on other fronts or kind of other theatres. The Middle East theatre, and camels are incredibly useful for covering distances. And there have been arguments made by historians that actually, even at some points during the Battle of the Somme, when the breakthroughs came and actually gaps have opened up in the line, if some of the generals had been less wary of chucking in the cavalry, then maybe those breaches would have been exploited quicker, because horses could have gotten across the gap of no man's land when the gaps in between the German lines appeared unexpectedly in ways that infantry couldn't. The image has always been of cavalry charging machine guns, and you do have examples of that. Again, partly in 1914 when you have that movement, and also kind of some cavalry charges at other points in the war. But the horse is still seen as kind of being a backbone, and certainly kind of from labour and moving ammunition and men around. Horses are incredibly important during during the First World War. But the thing that's always kind of made me kind of smile a little bit is that, so you end up with a vision of the First World War of being like, it's the old world dying, and the old world being summed up as cavalry charging machine guns, people not recognising that new military technology has arrived. But then when you look at the Second World War, which is viewed as being a hugely technological war with these amazing new tanks and planes and bombers and all of these various different bits and pieces.
So, to be fair, the early tanks were kind of useless, to be fair.
Yes. And the German army being viewed as, it's a blitzkrieg army, it's technologically superior, it's got Stukas and tanks and lorries and The German army in the Second World War, right throughout the Second World War, is an army heavily reliant on horsepower, literal horsepower. Towards even, by the time at the end of the war, when the Allies are racing around in amazing kind of tanks and trucks and stuff, the German army is still dragging stuff around by horses. And the German army that invades the Soviet Union is an army powered by horses. So, the horse still has military utility even in the Second World War, it just might not necessarily be the best thing that if you want to charge it against some machine guns.
I know we've referenced a lot of movies in this episode, and there's just so many good ones to take from in the World War One genre, and one of those, perhaps when it comes to horses, is of course the famous. I do think it's Spielberg, War Horse.
War Horse.
It's such a beautiful depiction of the horse's life in the First World War era, and it's even a musical, I think, at this point.
Yes, it started off as
it's such a great depiction of horses in the First World War.
Yeah.
The last thing I want to talk about before we round up is naval power in August of 1914, and because by that point, as many historians have pointed out, and probably will point out more, is that the German navy was the second largest to Britain by the early 1914. So let's talk about a little bit of naval power in the first month of the war.
Yeah, I mentioned the military conversations between Britain and France earlier on. And the basis of those military conversations was basically a shared accepted understanding between Britain and France. Yes, the British would put some troops on the continent. The French were very keen, we need more men. But the benefit of having Britain involved is the Royal Navy. They can deal with the German High Seas Fleet. They can institute a blockade that will starve Germany of material and food, which is actually what happens as the war goes on. The Allied naval blockade is a massive factor on Germany losing the war. But there's also a kind of a concern in France about the Royal Navy. So there were like potential flashpoints for the war to break out before 1914 happened, like in 1905 and 1907, when you end up with like various like Moroccan crisis, like imperial friction between France and Germany. And there's the Prime Minister of France at one point, when these military conversations are going on, and there's like a concern that there might be a localized war between France and Germany, says about the Royal Navy that the Royal Navy is great, it's massive, it's impressive, it's got a lot of firepower, but it doesn't run on wheels and therefore won't protect Paris. That boats are great if the war is fought at sea. If it's not fought at sea, then the Royal Navy is irrelevant. And you end up with, in the lead up to the First World War, there's also like a naval arms race going on between Britain and Germany, because the Royal Navy, their doctrine has always been to be larger than the next two navies in the world. And Germany keeps building more dreadnoughts, which means that Britain has to keep building more dreadnoughts, and you end up with this kind of naval arms race. And then war is declared, and the Germans at one point shell parts of the east coast of Britain in little lightning raids. But what becomes apparent is that neither the Royal Navy or the German High Sea Fleet actually want to have a battle, because a battle has a conclusion. If both fleets sail out and meet each other in combat full on, then one of them is going to win and one of them is going to lose. And that's great if you win, and it's devastating if you lose. Because if Germany loses and the High Sea Fleet is sunk, then the Royal Navy can start ferrying troops onto the north coast of Germany through the North Sea, and that's catastrophic, because they can completely outflank the Western Front. If the Royal Navy loses that battle, then same problem in reverse. The Germans could start landing troops in Britain. The whole of Britain becomes potentially open to them. So actually, fighting a battle is a worse idea than not fighting a battle. And you end up with this kind of very tentative stalemate where neither the Royal Navy or the German High Sea Fleet want to put to sea to force a naval resolution. And the closest you get is the Battle of Jutland in 1960, which is a messy, confused affair with no real clear winner. The Germans sink more British ships, but the British go, we sank greater tonnage, or who cares? But what you end up with is an extension of the stalemate, which actually suits Britain better than it suits Germany, because Britain is starving Germany because of the naval blockade. So the Royal Navy acts kind of similarly as one of those alliances at the beginning. It actually acts as a disincentive for the Germans to sail out, and similarly the High Sea Fleet kind of prevents the British from, sailing to the north coast of Germany, because there'll be U-boats and there'll be minefields and there'll be navy. And I spoke earlier on about the Germans being reckless in 1917. Like, their solution to not fighting on the surface is to submarines, is to have U-boats and sink shipping and sink ships as best they can. When the war takes the final negative turn in 1918, and the Germans get desperate again, and they get reckless again, and they, in September, October 1918, the order comes down to, the naval yards of Kiel, where the High Sea Fleet is based, to put to sea and force a final battle with the Royal Navy, and, definitely try and win it. And if you don't win it, we're losing anyway, so what's the big deal? And
you win some, you lose some.
You win some, you lose some. Which is fine if you're making that argument from Berlin. I imagine it's less convincing if you're one of the sailors who's going to win some or lose some by sailing out into a last dust-up with the Royal Navy.
Worst case, you drown in freezing water.
Yeah, great. I feel like such a winner. And I was talking about that morale issue, that, when soldiers start to think either winning this war isn't worth it, or we're losing this war regardless, so why should I risk my life? The naval soldiers go, well, we're losing this war anyway. I'm not sailing out to die pointlessly for a war that's already lost. And they mutiny. And they start running up red and black flags, and you start getting little new republics that start at that north coast of Kiel, and and then the revolution starts to spread through Germany, and it leads to the abdication of the Kaiser, and it leads to the collapse of the German government, and eventually leads to the armistice and the peace, because they look around and going, what good will us fight, even if we win, which we won't, because the Royal Navy is better fed than us, their morale is probably higher than us now, so we'll lose. What good comes from me dying pointlessly at sea for this? So actually, I've always wanted to be a Bolshevik or a revolutionary, so maybe I'll do that instead. And you see that as an expression of the collapse of German morale. That the German Navy, like, no, we're all right, thanks. I don't much fancy being blown up or drowning simply so that you can be desperate.
So, in all this our conversation, how would you conclude August 1914? What would you say? How would you conclude this month, the decisive month of World War I?
Yeah. So, I think there were two schools of thought. To bring it back to Barbara Tuchman's Guns of August, there were two schools of thought historically, but within historians, within historiography, about the reasons for the outbreak of war. And one of them is that no one really understood what was happening until it was too late to stop it. There are misunderstandings, there were confusions about alliances, and there are crossed signals in the language that people use. And it's only when suddenly armies are marching around that everybody realises what's happening, and it's too late to pull it back. And you get elements of that in the Guns of August, that actually events accelerate quicker than humans can get to grasp with them. And it's more modernly summed up with Christopher Clark's The Sleepwalkers, that basically it wasn't really anyone's fault. It was kind of everyone's fault. And if it's kind of everyone's fault, then it's kind of no one's fault. The events just happened too quickly and people didn't understand what was happening. Now, the other school of thought has always been it's Germany's fault. And that's what Fritz Fischer argues in the 1960s, that, Germany was planning for this, Germany wanted it, Germany gave Austria-Hungary the blank check, which is how it's referred to treat Serbia however they want to, because Germany will militarily back them up, because Germany wants this. This is what Germany has been waiting for. And those two have always acted in kind of the two ends of the spectrum. There's a middle ground that historians, probably like me, exist in. That, yes, the alliances are confusing. The diplomacy is not as clear as it needs to be in this aspect. And, clearly that there are nations who are quite keen to get this war going sooner rather than later. Definitely Germany is amongst them. France is probably amongst them to greater and lesser extents. But Austria-Hungary gets away awfully clean for being incredibly belligerent in July and August of 1914 and dragging this crisis out, and then imposing a series of terms or kind of conditions on Serbia that are so wildly outrageous. You know, there are things like the Austro-Hungarian Parliament will have control of the curriculum of Serbian schools. The Austro-Hungarians will pick the mayors of Serbian villages. It's insane stuff. You know, Austro-Hungary has to take control of the Serbian radio network, because Serbia's plan is to give a list of conditions that there is no way on earth that any nation could possibly agree to this stuff. It's designed to be rejected. And then the Austro-Hungarians have a massive problem, because it turns out the Serbians, to avoid war, agree to all but two of them. And the two that they don't agree with are basically on technical terms. And the British in London are reading these going, well, now what is Austria-Hungary going to do? Because actually Serbia has, far more than any sovereign nation could be expected to, agreed to this list of outrageous demands. So clearly Austria-Hungary is going to have to accept them, or basically go, no. These two technical rejections out of the 50 or whatever that we sent you allow us to go to war, and therefore show that their hand that this was never about kind of capitulation. It was about conquering Serbia. And that's exactly what happens. And as a result, I think, and there's certainly, other historians like me go, it's fine to go, yes, Germany has given Austria-Serbia a blank check, and, they have militarily backed them up, and they are a bigger, more important nation, and they need to take a share of the blame for this. But it's Austria-Hungary who cashed that blank check, and their behaviour for it is warmongering, and they should be judged as such.
So, I think we're going to round it up there. But there is one quote I want to do from Tuchman. I don't remember who said this, and again, that quote inspired Kennedy in the Cuban Missile Crisis when he was when they were almost so close to war, where Tuchman write about this to, I think, generals or soldiers who, I don't remember who, I'm sure you know who I'm talking about, and they asked, what were we really fighting for? And the other guy says, I don't really know or remember. I don't know the exact quote, but he says something like, I don't remember anymore. And how Kennedy said, like, in the White House a few decades, half a century later, like, I don't want to be that guy, that just started World War III, and people say, why were we fighting? Oh well, I don't know, I don't remember. So it's just again to use that quote, I think it's a nice quote to end this episode on. And of course, but before you go, and it's been a great pleasure to talk with you. I really enjoyed this conversation. And before you go, of course, where can people find your book, The Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire? And do you have any social media you want to promote, or links you want me to share in the description of this episode?
So, I mean, the Rise and Fall of the Galactic Empire, it's an official Star Wars book. I will never have a book that appears in more bookshops. So, you can find it online at Amazon and in most bookshops, kind of certainly in, Britain and America and places like that. I've got other books more about the First World War. So I've got a book about Allied relations, which is British, French and American relations on the Western Front, 1914 to 1918. You can get that online. I've got a book about the portrayal of the First World War in computer games. If you go onto my website, which is inventively called chriskempshall.com, you can find probably some discount codes for some of those and links to various retailers where you can kind of buy them and the like. You can find more about me on my website, or I'm on Twitter at Chris Kempshall. I'm on Threads at Chris Kempshall. I'm on Blue Sky at Chris Kempshall. I'm on Instagram at Chris Kempshall. So you'll find various bits and pieces of me doing history, First World War, Star Warsy stuff on all of those.
Thank you so much again for coming on. It's been a great pleasure to talk to you. This has been H12. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I certainly did. You can find us on social media under Instagram, H12, Twitter /X, or whatever it will be called tomorrow, under With That Age 12. We are available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts. If you are on Spotify listening to this, please leave a comment, because you can do that now apparently, and rate us 5 stars as well. That would be very nice. Or if you hated the episode or hate this podcast, you can rate us 1 as well. It's a free world, at least on this side of the continent. If you're on Apple Podcasts, consider writing a review. That would be great. I love reading reviews of the podcast. And if you are on YouTube, of course, leave a like, subscribe, and leave a comment there as well. This has been With That Age 12. My name is Ardennes, and I'll see you next time.